Old Hollywood sold perfection like a perfume bottle, flawless smiles, immaculate gowns, and romances that never smelled like anything but roses. But behind those airbrushed posters and carefully lit close-ups was a different scent altogether. Some icons who defined glamour walked onto sets trailing whiskey fumes, cigarette haze, and a breath so fierce cinematographers quietly rearranged blocking. Today, we're pulling the velvet rope and letting the stench out. 15 legends, each with a hygiene habit their publicists prayed you'd never hear about. From dental disasters to germ-phobic lockdowns to I'll bathe when I feel like it rebellions. This is the real unperfumed Hollywood. And yes, we're starting at the very top. The king whose smile melted America and wilted his scene partners. Clark Gable, the king and the close-up co-stars dreaded. Clark Gable's aura was bulletproof. The easy slant of his smile, the lapels cut like armor, the way a throwaway line landed like a promise. But that smile carried a secret. In 1933, after a vicious bout of gum disease, he reportedly had most of his teeth removed and was fitted with dentures while his star was still rising. Dentistry then was rougher, adhesives were crude, and the result, according to studio gossip that never quite died, was breath that could turn a love scene into survival training. Crews adored his charm. Scene partners braced for proximity. The issue wasn't just dental hardware. Gable was a product of his time. Long shooting days, coffee by the gallon, cigarettes like punctuation. Mix that with early denture materials, and you get a chemistry set no one wanted to stand too close to. Veteran script supervisors later recalled that on especially close days, blocking would subtly widen and eye lines tilt a hair off-axis, enough to preserve the illusion of intimacy while giving his partner a few precious inches of air. As the years stacked up, the legends stacked with them. Reported anecdotes from late career sets described co-stars who sang his praises in public and strategized in private. A dab of menthol ointment under the nose, a mint smuggled as a throat lozenge, a quick reset framed as a lighting tweak. Even when the rumor mill spun harder than the facts could support, the pattern stayed consistent. The king remained gracious, professional, and game, while directors quietly choreographed romance at arm's length. What makes Gable's case so sticky in Hollywood memory is the contrast. On-screen, he embodies effortless magnetism. Off-screen, colleagues remembered a very human maintenance problem the studio machine couldn't buff out. That tension, perfection in the frame, compromise just outside it, is exactly why his story still circulates. The myth was immaculate. The man, like all mortals, came with a scent. Rita Hayworth, the makeover that hurt. Rita Hayworth's rise to stardom wasn't just about talent, it was about reinvention, and much of that reinvention came at a painful price. When Columbia Pictures signed her, the studio wanted a glamorous, all-American beauty, not the Mediterranean look of Margarita Carmen Cancino. Executives ordered an excruciating series of electrolysis sessions to raise her hairline and lengthen her forehead. This wasn't a quick tweak, it was months of electric needles searing follicle after follicle, leaving her scalp raw and sensitive for the rest of her life. The process permanently altered her face for Hollywood's cameras, but it also created long-term discomfort she couldn't escape. Add to that the relentless hair dyeing. Hayworth was naturally a dark brunette, but Columbia demanded the fiery red mane that would become her signature. The dyes of the 1930s and 40s were chemical cocktails far harsher than anything used today. Over time, they stripped her scalp, aggravated the damage from electrolysis, and left her with chronic dermatitis. Hairstylists and makeup artists who worked with her had to become part-time medics, concealing redness, flaking, and oiliness, while somehow maintaining the illusion of perfection. The irony is that this tortured makeover became part of what cemented her legend. That high forehead, those sculpted waves of red hair, and the luminous skin became the face of American glamour during World War II. Servicemen pasted her photos in their lockers and carried her image into battle. They saw effortless beauty. She felt the constant reminder of invasive procedures and harsh treatments. It's one of Hollywood's cruelest contradictions. The very features that made her a star were carved and burned into existence at great personal cost. Even off-screen, Hayworth struggled with the fallout. She was known to complain about scalp pain and the endless maintenance her look required. Friends described her as warm and kind, but often exhausted by the sheer effort it took to maintain the love goddess image. To fans, Rita Hayworth was a dream. To those who knew her best, she was a woman who sacrificed comfort and, in some ways, her health for the Hollywood machine that demanded she be reborn. Howard Hughes, cleanliness to the point of decay. At first glance, Howard Hughes looked like the model of hygiene. In the 1930s, he was dashing, immaculately groomed, and famously demanding about order on his film sets. He changed shirts multiple times a day, wore tailored suits that looked freshly pressed even at midnight, and insisted that his office and editing rooms be spotless. Colleagues admired his sharp presentation and assumed his obsession with detail was simply part of the charm that came with being a perfectionist. But as his life unfolded, that obsession spiraled into something darker, turning his quest for cleanliness into the very thing that left him filthy. By the 1940s, the cracks were already showing. Secretaries and assistants described his elaborate hand-washing rituals, 15 minutes spent scrubbing, followed by the use of a brand new bar of soap each time. He refused to touch doorknobs, demanded freshly unwrapped towels for every use, and developed complex routines for how food could be served to him. These behaviors, rooted in his obsessive-compulsive disorder, grew more extreme as he aged. What had started as quirks of a fastidious man became barriers to normal living. The glamorous public figure who once strode confidently into premieres was slowly retreating behind rituals only he understood. By the 1960s, Hughes had withdrawn almost completely from public life. He became the archetype of the reclusive billionaire, shuttered in hotel rooms that he transformed into his germ-free zones, except they weren't clean at all. He would stay naked in darkened rooms for months at a time, his hair and nails growing long, while he refused to bathe. Staff reported he wore tissue boxes on his feet instead of shoes, believing they kept him uncontaminated. He lined up jars to relieve himself rather than risk leaving his sealed-off quarters. The man who once demanded perfection from Hollywood productions now lived surrounded by the detritus of his paranoia. What makes Hughes's decline so haunting is the contrast between perception and reality. To the outside world, he remained a titan, an aviator who broke records, a mogul who dated starlets, a name synonymous with wealth and innovation. But behind the curtain, his hygiene was a casualty of the illness that consumed him. His late-life image, gaunt, unkempt, and unwashed, was a far cry from the sharp figure who once dazzled Katharine Hepburn and directed epic films. In the end, Hughes didn't just lose control of his appearance, he lost the very balance between fear of germs and the basic care that keeps us clean. The pursuit of immaculate order left him living in the very chaos he feared most. Judy Garland. When the machine breaks the person. Judy Garland's struggles with hygiene weren't born from carelessness or rebellion. They were the inevitable result of a system that treated her body like a commodity. From her earliest days at MGM, she was subjected to a brutal routine of pep pills to keep her awake for marathon shooting schedules and sleeping pills to knock her out when the studio decided she had to rest. At just 16, while filming The Wizard of Oz, she was already trapped in this chemical cycle. The pills wrecked her appetite, disrupted her natural rhythms, and left her oscillating between hyperactivity and exhaustion. In that state, basic self-care, brushing teeth, bathing, even eating properly, was often forgotten. The consequences piled up as she grew older. Garland's appearance became erratic, one day radiant, the next haggard and unkempt. Makeup crews recalled mornings when she would arrive on set with her hair greasy and her breath heavy from cigarettes and gin, and they would have to perform small miracles to transform her into the star audiences adored. On her good days, she was meticulous about her look, even radiant in her attention to detail. On her bad days, she simply didn't have the strength. Hygiene became a reflection of her battle with addiction and mental health. Sometimes on top of the world, sometimes unable to manage the simplest tasks. Her dental health also suffered under this pressure. Years of neglect, combined with the effects of barbiturates and alcohol, left her with recurring oral problems that worsened her already fragile self-image. Co-stars and directors rarely spoke about it publicly, but in memoirs and behind-the-scenes accounts, the toll is clear. During the filming of A Star is Born in 1954, her then-husband Sid Luft reportedly assigned a personal assistant not just to manage her schedule, but to ensure she bathed, changed clothes, and kept up appearances. That assistant, as caregiver role, underscored just how much the industry had drained her ability to care for herself. What makes Garland's story so heartbreaking is the humanity behind the headlines. Unlike stars who consciously rejected hygiene standards, Garland's lapses were symptoms of deeper suffering. When she was well, she was dazzling, professional, charming, and immaculate. When she wasn't, she was a woman in pain, abandoned by a system that had profited off her since childhood. Her hygiene struggles weren't quirks to be gossiped about. They were physical manifestations of the damage inflicted by a studio machine that demanded everything and gave nothing back. Her tragedy reminds us that sometimes the smell of unwashed hair or stale alcohol isn't scandalous. It's the scent of survival in an industry that ate its brightest lights alive. Montgomery Clift. Crash, pain, and a mirror he couldn't face. Montgomery Clift was once the very definition of Hollywood elegance. Sharp suits, clean lines, and a polished presence that seemed effortless. He brought an intensity to the screen that was matched by his meticulous grooming off it. In the 1940s and early 50s, Clift embodied the new actor, serious and refined, a stark contrast to the rougher masculinity of earlier stars. But everything changed one night in 1956 when he crashed his car into a telephone pole after leaving a dinner at Elizabeth Taylor's house. The accident left his face shattered, his jaw broken, and his body in chronic pain. That trauma didn't just scar him physically, it unraveled the daily rituals that had once kept him immaculate. The recovery was brutal. Surgeries left his face partially reconstructed, but the man who once turned heads with his beauty now saw a stranger in the mirror. Chronic pain became his constant companion, and to cope he turned to alcohol and prescription drugs. Those dependencies dulled his agony, but also dulled his attention to basic hygiene. Friends and colleagues noticed the difference almost immediately. Clothes weren't washed as often, showers became irregular, and the once polished Clift began to show up to sets looking worn and unkempt. It wasn't a choice, it was survival in the only form he could manage. By the early 1960s, the change was undeniable. On the set of The Misfits, directed by John Huston, Clift's personal care had deteriorated to the point where makeup artists had to work overtime to prepare him for the camera. They weren't just covering scars anymore. They were compensating for stubble, unwashed hair, and the signs of exhaustion that clung to him. Colleagues often described him as sweet and professional, but his physical presence revealed the toll of addiction and pain. Elizabeth Taylor, always his defender, reportedly arranged for assistants to help him bathe and dress, determined to preserve some of the dignity he had lost. Clift's hygiene decline wasn't about vanity, it was about trauma. Before the crash, he had been one of Hollywood's most fastidious leading men. Afterward, personal grooming became just another burden piled onto the weight he already carried. The tragedy is that audiences still saw his brilliance on screen, but those close to him saw a man crumbling under the dual pressures of pain and dependency. His story isn't just about a Hollywood star who stopped bathing. It's about how catastrophe can strip away even the simplest self-care from someone once defined by discipline and grace. Marlon Brando. Method acting. Method stinking. Marlon Brando revolutionized acting with his raw intensity, but his relationship with hygiene was just as raw and far less glamorous. Even in the early years of his career, directors and co-stars noted that Brando often showed up to set without bathing, his body odor lingering in rehearsal rooms long after he left. For Brando, cleanliness seemed secondary to authenticity. If a role demanded sweat, he arrived sweaty. If a role called for grit, he brought it straight from his skin. It was as though he believed deodorant and soap would rob him of the realism he craved. During A Streetcar Named Desire, the film that cemented him as Hollywood's new sex symbol, his co-star Vivien Leigh reportedly found his scent overwhelming. Director Elia Kazan supposedly had to pull Brando aside more than once to remind him that while Stanley Kowalski was animalistic, audiences didn't need to actually smell it through the screen. But Brando wasn't careless. He was deliberate. He wanted Stanley to feel real, and in his mind, that meant showing up exactly as he was, body odor and all. The result was a performance that electrified cinema, even if it made those around him quietly reach for handkerchiefs. As the years passed, Brando's hygiene only grew more notorious. By the 1970s, when he was filming Apocalypse Now, he was no longer the lean young rebel, but an overweight and mercurial star who had stopped caring about appearances altogether. Crew members described him as erratic, unkempt, and carrying a stench that matched the chaos of the shoot. Francis Ford Coppola already struggled to manage Brando's unpredictable demands and improvisations. Dealing with his disregard for basic hygiene was simply another hurdle in an already infamous production. To many on set, Brando's smell became a metaphor for his larger-than-life disregard for rules, both Hollywood's and society's. What makes Brando's case fascinating is that his hygiene issues weren't rooted in neglect. They were a form of rebellion. He rejected the Hollywood machine that demanded stars look perfect at all times. He refused to play by the rules of stardom, and his refusal extended all the way to his own body. Whether he was making a statement or simply indulging in indifference, Brando turned poor hygiene into part of his myth. He was genius and grime rolled into one, proving that talent can make audiences forgive almost anything, even a smell that cleared a room. James Dean, rebel with the cause to skip the shower. James Dean wasn't just a rebel on screen. His off-screen habits carried the same disregard for convention, and that included hygiene. Friends and colleagues often described him as earthy, which was a polite way of saying he didn't always smell great. He would wear the same clothes for days, sometimes weeks at a time, brushing off suggestions to change with a shrug or a laugh. His leather jacket, immortalized in Rebel Without a Cause, became more than just a costume. It was practically a second skin. Dean believed the grime and wear made it look authentic, and in his world, authenticity mattered more than soap. On the set of Rebel Without a Cause, his co-star Natalie Wood reportedly found working with him both thrilling and challenging. The chemistry between them was undeniable, but she sometimes dreaded the close-up scenes because of his body odor. Crew members recalled that director Nicholas Ray had to diplomatically remind Dean to clean up before certain takes. Dean would listen, but his compliance was half-hearted. He seemed to take pride in the discomfort he caused, as though proving that Hollywood polish didn't matter if the raw performance was powerful enough. Dean's hygiene habits weren't entirely about rebellion, though. His early years in New York were marked by cramped apartments with unreliable hot water, and he often skipped showers out of necessity rather than choice. When he arrived in Hollywood, those patterns stuck, morphing into a lifestyle that looked and smelled like defiance. He wore dirty socks until they had holes, reused shirts until they were stiff, and brushed off the judgment of anyone who complained. To Dean, being unkempt was a way of rejecting the artificial polish that defined so many of his peers. The irony is that Dean's lack of hygiene became part of his allure. His disheveled look and lived-in clothes fed into the image of the tortured, authentic artist who lived outside the rules. Audiences didn't see the smell. They saw the charisma, the danger, the brooding masculinity. Dean's refusal to conform made him a symbol of rebellion for an entire generation. Yet behind the legend was a young man whose hygiene habits frustrated his co-stars, tested the patience of directors, and reinforced the truth that sometimes authenticity stinks. Errol Flynn, swashbuckler in yesterday's shirt. Errol Flynn was the poster child for adventure. On screen, he scaled castle walls, swung from ship riggings, and wooed leading ladies with a grin that seemed carved by the gods. Off-screen, though, the dashing rogue often carried with him a far less glamorous reality. The smell of stale liquor, sweat, and unwashed clothes. Flynn's love for heavy drinking was no secret, and as his career progressed, it began to seep through his skin. Colleagues described how his sweat carried the sharp tang of alcohol, making afternoon shoots especially unpleasant for those within arm's reach. His wardrobe habits didn't help. Flynn was notorious for sleeping in the same clothes he wore all day, sometimes rolling straight from a night of drinking into a morning call without changing. Costumers grew accustomed to refreshing his outfits far more often than those of other actors, sometimes sewing removable panels into his costumes so that sweaty sections could be swapped out without replacing the whole garment. This was a man whose screen persona was immaculate, but whose personal care behind the curtain became increasingly sloppy. The closer one stood to him, the harder it was to maintain the illusion of perfection. Even his co-stars felt the impact. Olivia de Havilland, who appeared opposite Flynn in 8 films, reportedly learned how to handle his habits with delicate tact. Rather than embarrass him, she would quietly offer a bottle of mouthwash from her dressing room, or suggest that a romantic scene might look fresher if they both freshened up first. Her diplomacy preserved Flynn's dignity while giving herself some much-needed relief. It was a behind-the-scenes dance of subtlety where colleagues tried to balance admiration for his charisma with the reality of his personal neglect. What makes Flynn's case striking is the duality. In front of the camera, he was the embodiment of vitality, the man every audience member wanted to be or to be with. But behind the scenes, his hygiene revealed the cracks caused by excess. Alcohol, late nights, and indifference to self-care stripped away the polish until even his legendary charm couldn't fully mask the smell. Flynn lived fast, and while audiences adored the thrill of his performances, his colleagues quietly endured the less than dashing truth of sharing a set with Hollywood's most famous swashbuckler. Elvis Presley, the king of rock with royal halitosis. Elvis Presley built his empire on image. The slick pompadour, the dazzling jumpsuits, and the curled lip that sent entire arenas into hysteria. Every detail of his look was rehearsed and perfected. Yet, behind the perfectly styled hair was a different story, one that his co-stars knew all too well. For all the hours Elvis spent grooming his famous locks, his dental hygiene was another matter. By the mid-1960s, years of sugary snacks, chain smoking, and prescription drug use had left his teeth in poor condition. The result, according to those who worked closely with him, was a breath that could sour even the most romantic on-screen kiss. Actresses who played opposite him often shared polite but telling anecdotes. Mary Ann Mobley, who co-starred with Elvis in Girl Happy, later admitted that his bad breath made their intimate scenes far less appealing than they looked on screen. Susanna Lee, another co-star, reportedly developed subtle tricks to avoid full lip contact during filming, angling her head just enough to preserve the illusion without enduring the reality. These weren't isolated complaints. They became part of a quiet pattern that followed Elvis through his Hollywood years. The audience swooned at the kisses. His co-stars sometimes winced. The contradiction was striking. On one hand, Elvis was meticulous about his image. He wouldn't allow himself to be photographed without makeup to cover blemishes. And he was obsessive about his hair, spending hours with pomades, dyes, and sprays to keep every strand in place. On the other hand, his mouth told a different story. As his reliance on prescription drugs deepened, brushing and flossing became inconsistent, if not forgotten entirely. Pills dulled his routines and dulled his awareness, turning a once vain young man into someone increasingly indifferent to the basics of hygiene. By the 1970s, during his Las Vegas residency, the decline was unmistakable. Elvis had gained weight. His health was failing, and his hygiene suffered alongside his body. Makeup artists and costumers did their best to present him as the king, but those close to him knew the truth. The legend was rotting from the inside out, and his breath was just one of many symptoms. For fans, Elvis remained a symbol of desire and power. For those who stood within kissing distance, he was also a reminder that even kings can smell very, very human. Elizabeth Taylor, Cleopatra's inconsistent bathing habits. Elizabeth Taylor was the very picture of Hollywood glamour: violet eyes, diamonds the size of walnuts, and a magnetic screen presence that defined an era. To the world, she looked untouchable, a goddess draped in couture. But behind the glittering facade, Taylor's personal hygiene could be surprisingly inconsistent. Those who worked closely with her noticed a pattern. When her life was stable and she was happy, she was immaculate, polished to perfection. But when her turbulent personal life unraveled, especially during the stormy years of her relationship with Richard Burton, her grooming habits often fell by the wayside. During the massive production of Cleopatra, one of the most expensive films in Hollywood history, crew members whispered about the contrast between the movie's lavish sets and the star's private habits. According to makeup artists, Taylor sometimes relied on heavy perfume and powder to mask days without a proper bath. In Italy, where the film was shot, local crew members reportedly commented on how American standards of cleanliness seemed looser than they expected. Taylor, with her reliance on strong fragrances, became a frequent example. For a woman cast as Cleopatra, the queen who bathed in milk, the reality was almost comically ironic. Those around her learned to handle the situation delicately. Director Joseph L. Mankiewicz reportedly developed a discreet system. When Taylor seemed particularly disheveled, a female assistant would casually inform her that a hot bath had been drawn in her trailer for her comfort. Framed as a luxury rather than a necessity, the suggestion allowed Taylor to refresh herself without embarrassment. It was a Hollywood solution to a Hollywood problem: preserve the star's dignity while quietly addressing the practical challenges of working in close quarters. Taylor's hygiene habits were deeply tied to her emotional state. When she was in love, she radiated confidence and self-care. When she was depressed or in the midst of turmoil, her interest in grooming waned. It wasn't a matter of rebellion, like James Dean or Marlon Brando. It was simply a reflection of her inner world. Fans saw Cleopatra, Maggie the cat, or the dazzling woman on the red carpet. Colleagues sometimes saw someone covering distress with Chanel No. 5. It's a reminder that even the most glamorous star in Hollywood could be undone by the simplest, most human struggles. Charlie Chaplin, the tramp's real-life odor. Decorator Charlie Chaplin built a career on a character who was shabby, unpolished, and often down on his luck. The tramp, with his threadbare suit, floppy shoes, and toothbrush mustache, was designed to look like he had slept in alleys and lived on crumbs. But behind the camera, Chaplin himself sometimes blurred the line between role and reality. When he was deep in the throes of writing or directing, he could work for days in the same clothes, skipping meals, shaving, or showers. Colleagues recalled that when Chaplin became obsessed with a project, he often neglected himself entirely, arriving on set disheveled and carrying the stale smell of long hours in confined rooms. His second wife, Lita Gray, infamously described his hygiene as poor in her divorce papers, claiming that bathing and grooming were not priorities for him. While her accounts were colored by the bitterness of their separation, others in Chaplin's orbit quietly supported parts of her story. Assistants and staff noted that when Chaplin locked himself away to edit or compose music, he could go unwashed for days, his creative genius taking precedence over everything else. To those who idolized him, this might have been shocking, but for those close to him, it was simply another facet of a man consumed by his work. That said, Chaplin was not permanently unkempt. He knew how to transform himself when the occasion demanded it. For premieres, interviews, or diplomatic appearances, he presented himself as the polished international celebrity, every hair in place, his tuxedo immaculate. The switch was almost theatrical in itself. The same man who could resemble his scruffy alter ego in private suddenly appeared before cameras as the epitome of elegance. In those moments, he reminded the world that he understood the power of image better than anyone. He had, after all, built a global empire on it. The duality of Chaplin's hygiene mirrored the duality of his life. To audiences, he was the genius who brought laughter to millions. To his wives, colleagues, and confidants, he was sometimes the man who smelled like he hadn't stepped out of the editing room in a week. His hygiene wasn't about rebellion or decline. It was about obsession. When he was chasing perfection on screen, showers and fresh clothes simply didn't register. For the man who created the most beloved shabby character in cinema, being a little shabby himself was perhaps inevitable. Humphrey Bogart. Bad breath behind the tough guy facade. Humphrey Bogart's screen persona was irresistible. A man of few words, cigarette dangling from his lips, eyes narrowed under the brim of a fedora. He became the embodiment of rugged cool, a figure audiences associated with danger, romance, and effortless masculinity. Yet those who acted opposite him often endured a very different experience. Bogart was a heavy smoker, reportedly up to 3 packs a day, and he washed it down with whiskey, which he sipped almost as casually as his cigarettes. Combined with minimal dental care, the result was chronic halitosis that made intimate scenes with him a challenge, even for consummate professionals. Co-stars developed their own coping strategies. Ingrid Bergman, who filmed unforgettable close-ups with Bogart in Casablanca, never complained publicly. But insiders claim she asked director Michael Curtiz to minimize the number of takes requiring her to face him head-on. Lauren Bacall, who later became his wife, seemed to be one of the few women unfazed by it, perhaps because genuine love overcame what others found unbearable. Their chemistry in To Have and Have Not was real. And Bacall later said Bogart's flaws were just part of the package she adored. For her, his bad breath wasn't an obstacle, it was irrelevant in the face of their connection. Others weren't as forgiving. By the time Bogart starred in The African Queen with Katharine Hepburn, his oral hygiene had worsened, exacerbated by years of smoking and drinking. Hepburn, herself a heavy smoker, diplomatically referred to aromatic challenges on set, a polite euphemism for the haze that hung between them during filming in Africa. Director John Huston, who shared Bogart's love of liquor and cigarettes, brushed it off, considering it part of the atmosphere rather than an issue to be solved. For Huston, Bogart's flaws only added to the realism of his tough guy image. Bogart himself didn't deny his habits, nor did he make any effort to change them. To him, the bad breath was simply a byproduct of the life he had chosen, the hard-drinking, chain-smoking lifestyle that matched his role so well. If anything, it made his tough guy facade more authentic, even if his partners quietly wished for a mint between takes. The man who famously said, "Here's looking at you, kid," might have left his co-stars looking away when the camera stopped rolling. It's a reminder that sometimes the screen's greatest illusions came at a personal cost to those who had to share the frame. Joan Crawford. A smile that fought back. Joan Crawford built her career on control. Every gesture, every stare, every costume was calculated to project strength and glamour. But behind her commanding screen presence was a secret battle with her teeth and gums that she couldn't fully control. Following Hollywood trends of the 1930s, Crawford underwent aggressive dental procedures designed not just to improve her smile, but to alter her entire facial structure. Like Marlene Dietrich, she reportedly had teeth removed to create more dramatic cheek hollows, enhancing the angular look the camera loved. What the public never saw was the pain and long-term dental complications that came with those decisions. The cosmetic work left Crawford with recurring infections and gum problems that plagued her for decades. Dentists filled gaps with cement and fitted her with caps that caused swelling and irritation. Her upper lip became permanently enlarged, a feature that many came to recognize as part of her iconic look, though it was the product of painful medical interventions rather than natural beauty. Even into her 60s, she required major dental surgeries that left her bedridden and in need of constant medical care. To her fans, Crawford's smile symbolized power and allure. To her doctors, it was a fragile construct that demanded constant maintenance. The contrast was almost surreal. Crawford was infamous for her perfectionism in every other area of her life. She scrubbed her hands until they were raw, insisted her home sparkle with cleanliness, and expected those around her to meet her exacting standards. Yet, despite all this discipline, her mouth remained a battlefield. Makeup artists who worked with her often commented on the irony. While they powdered her skin to hide every imperfection and tailored her costumes to project precision, they had to work around dental issues that could not be disguised as easily. Even her breath, colleagues whispered, could be unpleasant, especially when she was drinking heavily, which only worsened the problem. Crawford's dental struggles highlight one of Hollywood's cruelest contradictions. The industry that demanded her perfection also pushed her into procedures that left her permanently damaged. To the outside world, she was the embodiment of control, a woman who bent reality to her will. Behind closed doors, however, she suffered from a body that resisted that control, one painful infection at a time. Her smile remains one of the most recognizable in film history, but knowing the hidden story behind it makes that glamour seem far less effortless. and far more tragic. Tallulah Bankhead, the wild child who didn't care to wash. Tallulah Bankhead lived as loudly as she spoke. Known for her husky voice, outrageous one-liners, and scandalous love life, she embraced chaos with open arms. Her personal hygiene was no exception. Unlike many of her Hollywood peers who tried desperately to maintain the illusion of polish, Bankhead wore her lack of grooming like a badge of honor. She often joked that bathing too much dried out her skin, and friends recalled that she could go days without stepping into a tub. If her co-stars or lovers found it unpleasant, Tallulah didn't care. She thrived on shocking people, and poor hygiene was just another way to rebel against the expectations of propriety. Her lifestyle only amplified the problem. Bankhead drank heavily, smoked incessantly, and used drugs with the same reckless abandon she applied to everything else in life. Those habits left their mark, not only on her health, but also on her scent. Party guests often remembered the mix of bourbon, tobacco, and sweat that followed her into a room. On stage, her charisma was so overwhelming that audiences overlooked it. But behind the scenes, colleagues sometimes found working with her physically exhausting. Not because of her talent, but because of the atmosphere she carried with her. Unlike stars who felt shame about similar struggles, Bankhead leaned into hers. She made quips about her habits, spinning them into part of her legend. "I'm as pure as the driven slush," she once declared, capturing the exact blend of wit and decadence that defined her. Hygiene for her wasn't a private failing. It was an extension of her performance. She enjoyed being outrageous, and if that meant admitting she hadn't bathed in 3 days, so much the better. She was a woman who believed that rules, social, sexual, or hygienic, were for other people. By the twilight of her career, Bankhead's habits had only grown more erratic. During the filming of Die, My Darling, co-star Stephanie Powers later confessed that working with her was a multi-sensory experience, requiring patience and stamina. But for all the discomfort she caused, Bankhead never stopped being fascinating. Her lack of hygiene wasn't just tolerated, it became part of the wild, untamed persona that audiences and gossip columnists couldn't get enough of. Tallulah didn't try to hide the smell of her life. She let it announce her arrival. The studio sold perfect. The crews smelled reality. Sometimes the gods really were marble. Sometimes they were mortals with coffee breath, cigarette hands, and perfume standing in for a shower. If this peek behind the fan poster made your jaw drop or your nose wrinkle, tell me which star shocked you most, and who should we dig into next? The wardrobe disasters, the wild on-set meals, or the secret sleep habits that changed the way classics were shot?